Hey everybody. So I had jury duty this week and am a little bit behind on everything from my actual job to making videos for you guys. I wanted to talk a little bit about sex and gender in sociology. There's a fly here. I wanted to talk about sex and gender here in sociology in in hopefully not too. I want to stray from the book a little bit and talk about how sex and gender has changed in sociology since I started back in the early 90s. When I was young and going to grad school the first time, if you talked about sex and gender, most likely you were talking about um, about feminism, right? And there's a tremendously rich and robust body of work focusing on feminism, talking about first wave, second wave, third wave feminism, and I would say if you're interested, it's really good stuff. You should go look it up. And the history really is, as near as I understand it, the first thing was trying to get women equal access before the law, which meant owning property without a husband's signature, letting women vote. Oh my goodness. And making sure they weren't discriminated against in the workplace and such. The second wave, as I understand it, was, or at least the next part, I don't know if that was technically the second wave, was moving towards getting folks equal access to opportunity in the culture. So that would include, this fly is killing me, that would include making sure that, for instance, girls in high school had access to the same number of sports as boys did. And it is interesting to think that even, back when I was young enough to be in high school, that there might not have been equal opportunity in terms of the number of sports girls could do. And then okay, so that's that stuff. There's also in sociology this idea of doing gender, which comes from you can see elements of it arising from what we were talking about last week or the week before with Goffman and dramaturgy, right? If gender is a role we play, just like everything else, according to Goffman, then doing gender is acting out your gender in a way that people understand and make sense of in our world, right? You act a gender the same way you act the way you act like a professor or wait staff or student or anything else. You act like a man or woman. There was also a strain of sociology that studied sexuality, and that history in and of itself is interesting too. You go back to, I want to say it was like 1974 or something, but there was a meeting of the American Psychology Association where it may have even been in San Francisco, but a bunch of gay psychologists showed up, and they boycotted because at that time homosexuality was still listed by the APA as a disorder, right? And these guys showed up to say, look, this isn't a disorder, we're fine, leave us alone, we just happen to be gay. And so there was that. And there has been a strain of sociology which has researched gay and lesbian lives and identities. And so in that world, that's where you get this notion of queer theory, where you're trying to reinterpret the world, understanding that homosexuality is often been stigmatized. And so, you know, what does the world look like then if you're trying to sociologically understand it as a from a perspective of recognizing the oppression of homosexuality? That's a good way to say it. And way back in 92 maybe, I was in deviance class, and we read a book called Fantastic Women. And deviance in sociology is a lot of fun because people think you're going to read about weirdos and criminals. And yes, you do read about weirdos and criminals, but in fact, that's not actually the way sociology understands deviance. Sociology understands deviance more as a social process. So, what a community decides is acceptable or not acceptable, what a community decides is deviant or quote unquote normal behavior, is also how a society determines who is an insider and who is not, who belongs in that society and who doesn't. You know, quite straightforward. If you are going to behave like that, you're not one of us, essentially. And it ends up being a lot of fun as a course. I love that course. I love that topic. And I bring that all around to say, so in whatever, I'm reading this book called Fantastic Women, and the whole book is about cross-dressers, or transvestites, as you would have said back then. And it was intriguing because it delved into these men's lives and interviewed them and with no judgment, because as a good sociologist, you're trying to understand this from a morally neutral, ethically neutral position as possible. And without judgment, it's asking, they're talking to these guys and many of them have, very just normal looking lives, except they'll dress up as women at home. A few of them would try and go out in the world and pass as women, but for the most part, this idea of cross-dressing was so taboo that they couldn't even be caught by their wives dressed as women. And so the title of the book was Fantastic, like fantasy women. But as the researchers dug in, it was clear that for some of these guys, it was just, it was something they had to do, whatever that meant. And they sometimes risked a lot to do it. Okay, so if you would have asked before, I guess it's a little while now, but I want to say 5 or 6 years ago in a class on sex and gender, what you would be covering, mostly you would end up talking about feminism, about sexuality, about the oppression that women or gay people might have faced in society. And then all of a sudden, one day it changed, right? And hold on, I'm going to put the cat out. Now he doesn't want to go out. There's scary noises. Okay. Okay, so before we get to the change, let me lay out how I used to try and talk about this. I talked about this, or I tried to understand it in terms of what I called the sex or gender triangle. All right, and so the sex or gender triangle, you've got sex at the top, gender over here. Oh shit, I'm gonna have to invert this whole video, aren't I? And sexuality here. So what do we mean by that? Well, And again, this is a little bit old-fashioned, but it's important to understand. So, sex would be your physicality. Do you have a pee-pee or do you have a vagina? Right? I mean, it's that straightforward. What's in your genes? Genes or a Jeans? It works either way. You know, what kind of body do you have? Gender then becomes a social part of that, right? What are the social roles and expectations that come from being in a male body or a female body? And then sexuality is really, in short, who do you want to be naked with? Okay. Now, if you're a certain kind of, and there's a lot of caveats to all of this, if you're a certain kind of conservative, you see that those things all go together, right? If you are born with a penis, you act like a man and you want to be naked friends with women, period. And very often, traditional societies, traditional communities would work really hard to control that behavior and make sure people did those things. This is why the Fantastic Women book was kind of interesting, because these were men physically who were dressing like women. They're showing a different gender. That's not okay. That's terrible. You gotta, if they get found out, their whole social lives, their careers could be ruined. Notice that also works with sexuality. If you're a man, you want to be naked friends with women. And so there's this idea called compulsive heterosexuality, where even if you happen to want to be gay, you would live a straight life with a straight wife, because you didn't really have an option otherwise, right? And you go back far enough, and by far enough I mean what, 10 years ago, gay marriage wasn't even accepted yet as a legal thing. You go back much before that, and it would be a tremendous scandal if somebody found out you were gay, right? Part of the reason San Francisco got a reputation for being a gay mecca was because people could go there and be safe. And I think there's a club in Atlanta called Stonewall, if I'm not mistaken. I hope I'm not getting things wrong. And it's called Stonewall because in the, I don't know if it was the 70s or 80s, but it was since I was alive, a riot, the Stonewall riot, where up in, I want to say New York City, where the cops are the ones who beat the shit out of the gay folks who were there. It was okay to beat up a fag, right? Now, I don't think it's okay. I don't think you should use that language. But if you go back to when I was a kid, the way you would insult in my Catholic grade school the other boys was by calling them all sorts of gay slurs. And Matthew Shepard happened after I was in college, which is just kind of unbelievable to think about. So, and that's where the deviance part that I mentioned earlier comes in. In a world where these are your expected behaviors, then whatever's on the outside gets sanctioned. And, there are formal sanctions, like being stuck in jury duty, where those guys were facing sanctions. But there are also informal sanctions. Can you insult them? Can you beat them up and get away with it? Can you, right? All of this stuff. And so, so that's, okay, so that's that. That's all that's to say, if you're a certain kind of conservative, right, your sex and your sexuality and your gender all go together, and they make a very clear life pattern for you. Okay, now let's start thinking about how we can disaggregate this a little bit. So first of all, sex, we understand to be binary, but let's delve into what that means. When we say something's binary, it means there's like two choices, period. The light can be off or on. That's binary. While it is true that, you better not be scratching up my chair. Okay, when it comes to the biology part of sex, there are a few folks, it's not binary, right? Okay, here we go. Yes, so this is binary. If sex were perfectly binary, the world would be, everyone would be either completely male or completely female. But we don't have that. I don't know the right word. Technically, when I was young, you had hermaphrodites. More recently, I've heard of intersex. And there are more of those guys than you think. But there are a variety of people who, for whatever reason, end up in the middle here. So it's not a all one or all the other, but a Humpty Hump, bimodal. See, a mode is where most things are. This is not a normal distribution. This is a bimodal distribution. And these people in the middle, how do you end up in the middle? Well, since we're talking biology, and since I'm a sociologist, I've only got a couple of answers. But you can have people who have different genetic structure. We think women are XX and men are XY, but there are some people who have the third. They might be an XXY, for instance. There are some hormonal things, as I understand it, and you have to go look this up yourself, so you want to be sure. But there are some hormonal things that can happen during gestation, when someone's mother is pregnant, and even some hormonal things which can happen later in life, which can affect your physical expression of your sex, right? And so whatever those people are in the middle, those are the in-between people. And it might be 2-3%, but it doesn't mean they don't matter. Now, you will hear some people make the case that I think it's important to be very clear here, because binary is one thing. Everybody's this and everybody's this. Saying something like sex, meaning the biology part, is a scale, implies that there's a smoother transition than a bimodal distribution would say. So, are there people, is the world male and female? Are there people, no, not perfectly. There are people in between. Do the people in between change or disprove the bimodalness of sex? The answer to that is also no. But when you hear people saying it's one or the other here, to me that's a kind of an orange flag that they're talking politics. God made men and women. Well, yes, or sex is a scale. I'm like, yeah. To me, those are both political arguments to try and make some larger point, and they're free to make their larger point. I'm not against that at all. But okay, so that's the sex part. Now let's look at the. Well, we talked about. Well, no. Let's talk about sexuality. Okay, sexuality. We know that you can have straight, we know that you can have gay, right? So there's two kinds of sexuality. I'm much more open to people talking about there being a scale of sexuality than a scale of sex, precisely because when it comes to sexual behavior, people are all over the map, right? And to say someone's 100%, to say everyone's either 100% straight or 100% gay seems just as misinformed or as unlikely as it is to say everyone, that there are no in-between people when it comes to physical sex. I think there are probably, well, it sure seems like nowadays there are plenty of people who are in between that what we might have called bisexual, and maybe we still do, that there's growing acceptance of that, as well as growing acceptance of homosexuality. So clearly sexuality as just being interested in the opposite sex doesn't really work. The study of sexuality is its own thing. You've got the Kinsey studies, you've got Masters and Johnson, Freud thought a lot about sex. So people have been interested in sexuality studies, and there's a lot there if you want to go into it. I don't know. It's clear to me that sexuality is all over. Back when we were more likely to think of being homosexual as deviant, there was, people would wonder how, since we thought it was deviant, we'd say, how did somebody end up gay, right? And, they had all sorts of ideas that, mothers who were too nice to their boys and the boys didn't get tough enough, they end up gay, right? Or people, again, going with like hormone things. My model, until they come up with something like that, is in order for nature to work, you just need people to be horny enough to accidentally get pregnant occasionally. And so it doesn't matter who they're shagging, right? Just as long as people end up pregnant sometimes. And that model works for me until we actually come up with some accounting for why people might be straight or gay. Once you step away from the ethical parts of all of that, then the moral parts, the stuff that get people's undies in a bunch, then see that my phone flashes work notifications and I get lost. Once you step away from asking a question like that about sexuality, which people have opinions about, and say get around to, do you like onions or not? People just don't really care. Some people like onions, some don't. Yeah, well, what do you know? Some people like this, some people like that. Who cares? But so sexuality is all over. People have studied it. They do study it. And I don't know that we have any answers, but it is a lot of fun to read some of the different stuff. I think I read somewhere just a couple of weeks ago, if I can remember the book, strippers make like 20 or 30% more in tips when they're ovulating. That sounds like weird pheromone stuff, but it's interesting. It's fun. Okay. Although pheromones would be biology, but whatever. Okay. Gender. Gender is where the world really has gotten interesting the last few years. So as a sociologist, our take on gender over the last, since the beginning, has been, what role do you expect people who are men and women to play, right? And you can see immediately the breakdown of that, especially with the discussion of the expressive and the instrumental roles in the family. So, if your daughter is 17 years old and gets in a car crash on the way to school, you would hope that one of the other fathers would, if they drove past, would stop and help her, right? If you're a dad and you're driving your kid to school and you see somebody else's kid's car crashed, like, as a man, it's your job to go help, right? It just absolutely is. However, as a man, if you are, hell, I am in a department store shopping for, I don't know, ties. I don't wear ties, I work from home. And you see a lost little kid who's crying, you do not take that child's hand and take that child to the desk, right? When it comes to helping take care of little kids, that's a woman thing, right? So a woman could say, "Oh, little child, I will take you to customer service. We'll find your mom," and no one's going to think that's weird. If, however, I'm walking with a crying child and the mom happens to see me, they're going to haul me off for being being a kidnapper or something, right? So when it comes to gender, men are supposed to fix things, build things, do things, go to war. And when it comes to gender, women are supposed to provide love, provide caring, provide support, I don't know, do inside house stuff, and men do outside house stuff. And that's so a big chunk of third wave feminism, when I think about it, was about making sure that that some of those things were gone. When I look at who's driving truck nowadays, I see plenty of women who are truck drivers. But when I had jobs in warehouses when I was in college, the whole summer could go by and you might not see more than one female truck driver, right? Because it just wasn't what women did. And the funny thing about that is, when you think of women doing women's jobs and men doing men's jobs, is it's not like as a warehouse worker or a construction worker, you're actually, lifting 300 pounds on a regular basis. That's what the tools are for, right? And can a woman drive a forklift? Sure. Can a woman operate a hand pallet? Sure, right? Can a woman drive a truck? Sure. And can a man be a nurse? Yes. Were they when I was young? Not so much, right? Because men were doctors. So that's a big chunk of the understanding of gender from when I was young, and a big chunk of trying to understand what gender meant up until a few years ago. And there's a lot there. Arlie Hochschild wrote a book called The Second Shift, and was very, very critical of women entering the workforce, not because women entered the workforce, but because when the 80s came and women can do everything and they went to the workforce, guess what didn't happen? Their husbands didn't start helping around the house. And so the whole point of the second shift was, yeah, women get to go do man stuff, but then they still have to do all the women stuff back at home. So that's the second shift. And I don't think it's quite as bad as it was when she wrote the book in Lives Nowadays, but it's still, there's still certainly some of that, right? And we still have those gender expectations. And in some ways, maybe it's okay, right? Like, maybe it's okay that there are different expectations on average for men and women, as long as if a woman wants to do, construction work, she can, and if a man wants to be nurturing, he can, and we don't give him shit for it, right? Then that's okay. Now, here's the thing. The language around gender, and I'm bringing all of that up to point out that up until 5-7 years ago, that would have been fine. Within the last several years, this whole discussion of trans has popped up, And to my mind, the discussion of gender has gotten exceedingly sloppy, right? Now, one of the first, and I'll talk about that in a moment, but one of the first things is all of a sudden you hear people saying, you know, like, sure, I'm a man, but what if on the inside I feel like a woman? Well, okay. As a sociologist, I have no way to deal with that. That sounds, as a psychologist, you'd be like, oh, okay, so this person has gender dysphoria. There's a disconnect between what they are on the outside and what they feel like, or what their body is and what they feel like. But that's from the inside, right? That's gender identity. Now, I am not, I did not do gender sociology. It was interesting and I read plenty, but it wasn't like I was into it. And so I don't recall there being a very clear distinction between identity, as in the gender that I feel, and the social roles, the gender roles. There has been a discussion over the last 20 or 30 years about how people, well, like I said, like how do you do gender? You act male or female in some ways. You express an identity, but there hasn't been a ton of clear distinction between the role and the identity. It was just kind of there. But in today's world, with it was there. It was kind of assumed. There we go. But in today's world, where we're talking about whether or not someone feels like their gender, then you actually have to start talking about it, which means, right, that if you go back to the triangle, then one side of this has to be the roles, and another side of this has to be identity and expression. Right? Roles and expression. And that's going to be where, and that's where this almost needs its whole own page, because when we start thinking about the gender discussion, yes, I can feel, oh shit, man, there's so much. I can feel like a man or a woman, whatever that means. I can dress or act like a man or woman, again, whatever that means. And I can fulfill these different roles. Now, again, before 5 to 7 years ago, gender non-binary was a thing, but not nearly so explicit as it seems to be now. And I'm saying 5 to 7, it might be more like 7 to 10, but I remember standing in the classroom, so maybe that was 2016, and realizing that whatever I was saying in class was not resonating with those folks, because they were thinking about this in this new modern way where it's gender identity, gender expression, where people have opinions about trans, whether it's okay or not, whether it's deviant or not. And, just immediately before that, we'd have been talking about the second shift. We'd have been talking about sexual violence against women. We'd be talking about, female truck drivers. So let me delve into that gender non-binary. And again, this 1950s man or woman is a good starting point to think about. I mean, it's an ideal type, and it even always was. But it's even if it's not a perfect representation of people, it's a good place to start. So if we think about the ideal man or woman in the 50s, 60s, 70s, or even 80s, then, men didn't have long hair, they didn't wear makeup, they didn't paint their nails, they didn't wear frilly lace. Women didn't cut their hair short. They didn't work out and grow muscles. They didn't, it was very, very distinct what you were going to do. And even in the 80s, there was a SNL, which would not be okay nowadays, Saturday Night Live, piece that kept coming back, and it was about this character, Pat. And um, Pat had like a curly wig. Pat had was a little overweight in his or her stuffy clothes, and the reason it was funny was because in this, and it was a recurring skit that that they revisited on the regular. In that all of the other people were trying to understand or trying to guess whether Pat was a man or a woman the whole time through, and with a name like Pat, right? And the person just, you couldn't get it, and it was funny. People would not make that joke nowadays, and but it was funny, right? And so that's non-binary, but that's non-binary on accident. Uh, if we went to a little ways back, you might say that a woman with short hair and a certain kind of clothes was a little bit butch, right? And so you might have a butch woman. You could also have very girly girl women, and a guy that spoke a certain way and wore I don't know, wore like bright colors, or it might be a dandy, might be metro, or it might be a little frou-frou, right? So that boy's a little light in the loafers. I have no idea where that came from, but it's what they used to say. So you'd have a fairly effeminate man, or you'd have these super butch macho guys, right? And even that, when folks would talk about that, was still working from the idea that you had men and you had women, and you had, right, this gender expression fit the sex, just maybe it was a little bit over here or a little bit over here. The idea of non-binary just gets rid of the sex, right? And in a non-binary world, if you want to have short hair, you can have short hair. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. If you want to have long hair, it doesn't matter. You can have long hair. It doesn't matter if you're a man or a woman. And that's okay. I mean, it's not that it's good or bad or right or wrong, but it is that it's a very different way of thinking about it. Because again, instead of saying, well, you can have effeminate men or butch women, which are kind of two different things, nowadays those folks would just be in the middle somewhere, and you would have to ask them what their pronouns are. Now, where do I get frustrated with this conversation? And it's not a political component at all. I get frustrated with this conversation because when you hear things like some men are mothers, or some men menstruate, or trans women are women, and this isn't to take away from any trans people at all. That's not what I mean. What I do mean is when I hear those things, I'm thinking back to, okay, so we have sex, that's the physical part. We have gender, that's the expression and the social roles expectation part. And we have sexuality, which may or may not play into this conversation. When this language first started popping out, to me, it felt like an almost a deliberate attempt at obfuscating or muddying these terms, almost to, and again, it's political. We're trying to drive the culture this way or drive the culture that way, almost to a point where, well, to make a point. There we go. To make a point, and it felt to me at the time, again, 5 to 7 years ago, that we didn't need to screw up the language we had to try and talk about these things, to make space for trans people in the public sphere. Like, just, not just, because I don't mean that, but I do mean, we had the words for sex and gender, and mashing them up again brings up whole new sets of problems. Anyway, now the thing is that you know, I don't hold on too tightly to that, because I'm not, the world moves on. People change the way they talk about things. We live in a non-binary world. We live in a world where trans is now not deviant. You wouldn't read Fantastic Women in a deviance class, because they're actually protected legally in a lot of ways. You would read Fantastic Women in a sex and gender class or a sexuality class, but not a deviance class, right? So I think that's, to me, it's been absolutely fascinating to watch over the last few years, this evolution, right? And it's changed really a lot of stuff. Like, the culture has moved. So when you think about someone like J.K. Rowling, who has pissed off everyone on the left because she hasn't embraced trans the way that the left wanted, and I'm trying to say that very carefully, you have to understand what a radical change this is, because again, 10 years ago, J.K. Rowling would have been the most annoying kind of feminist, the most strident kind of feminist you could come up with, because she was so much about protecting women, and she had a good reason for it. Her background, her history was full of, like, spousal abuse, just terrible stuff. And there is still a really troubling amount of sexual violence against women in general, yes, but also against women specifically in the culture. So so her points were all right. And then when she said, it seems like men, right, biological men, dressing as women and then claiming that they're not accepted, or that they're suffering from the problems women face, JK says, well, that seems like, men taking advantage of women again. It's a man taking advantage of women's space. And a man not having gone through women's puberty and women's high school, right, is just, how can that person have really any understanding of what problems women face as women, right? And when we talk about women's problems, including physical things like the workplace not giving room for pregnancy and childbearing, right? Or issues like endometriosis not being taken seriously, or issues like the medical research industry, which, until fairly recently did most of their research on men, and then just assumed that, you just adjust your numbers, your dosages for women because they're just like men but smaller. Those are all women's problems that have to do with the physicality of being a physical woman, right? And so someone like JK says, well, you guys, this is ridiculous. Like sure, these folks have problems, but they're not women's problems, right? Well, of course, the whole world, the whole Harry Potter world went nuts. Harry Potter started to decline. People didn't love her nearly as much. And I'm not trying to make excuses for her. She doubled down and got actually not actually, she doubled down and got obnoxious, and you know, the rest is history. But it's interesting to think that that first point about women's problems being having to actually deal with women's physical bodies as much as the social and the social roles is gone. So when you say something like trans women are women, that whole understanding of what problems women face gets completely changed, right? It's fascinating. Like, I love it. And, you know, all that aside, I don't want to sound like, I already said this once, but I don't want to sound like JK. I don't want to, you know, have the culture move on and all of a sudden, instead of being a progressive, I'm a reactionary. The world moves. I'm fine with that. I actually think it's awesome that we live in a world where it's not okay to beat up trans people because, you know, they're different. But it does mean that the understanding of sex, gender, and sexuality is changing. And, you know, to consider that that's been, like I said, maybe the last 5 years, and 10 years ago, gay marriage is legalized. If you had asked me in 2005 if gay marriage was ever going to get legalized, I would have thought, not in my lifetime, much less that trans people would be accepted. And accepted should go in air quotes, because you don't have to like, I'm not saying you have to like them, but you can't beat them up, right? You can't fire them just for being trans. And in the past, that was all okay. And so, so this is wild. So what did we do today? We talked about the sex and gender triangle. We talked about, the sex and gender triangle. We talked about bimodal instead of binary, and how that works for, and how bimodal is a better example of the physical part of sex, of your sex. We talked a little bit about sexuality, right? Who you want to be naked with. Not a ton, but some, and there's more. If you have questions, ask me. And we talked about gender, talking about the roles a little bit, but then also this new, emergence of identity and expression as a huge part of it. Okay, so this is supposed to be a short video, and it's now at 48 minutes. So my apologies, but this is a lot of fun, and I wanted to get this up there for you because I don't want you to get too far ahead of me. Thank you, and goodbye.